I mean, it really becomes easy to wrap yourself deep into a theory. And in fact, that's sort of where your time goes. Like you want to get into a certain corner of theoretical space. And then you want to see it from that point of view and then see where you can make a contribution or add something or like say, no, this connects over there. But what's really challenging is to be able to do that and then go to a completely, like for instance, thinking about higher theories and then to sort of uproot your entire mental system and then say, what if I'm a panpsychist now? Or what if I'm a global workspace theorist? That's very difficult to do. And I think people, you spend so much time trying to understand a particular point of view that trying to understand another one is almost, it's alien. It's difficult to break out of the conceptual structure that you had to build in order to understand in the detail that you do this particular way of approaching it. Which is why when you really look at what a lot of work is, when they object to another theory, they're just expressing their own theory in another way, so to speak. The objection doesn't really target the other theory because they haven't really put themselves in that position and fully thought out, like, from this point of view, what does the theory say? Which is why I always tell students it's really easy to tear down another person's theory. What's really difficult is to say, why would a non-idiot come to this view? Why would someone who's not stupid but is intelligent have this theoretical outlook, which from my point of view is so strange or whatever? That's much more difficult because it requires sort of taking serious the other way of looking at things. To sum all this up in my, put it together, hopefully, I really endorse the kind of Socratic idea about what philosophy is, that to really should question one's own belief until you get to the point where you recognize that you don't know. That's what philosophy really is a self-evaluation, a self-undermining, in a way. Everything that you think you're going to lean on as your fundamental crutch, that's where you got to focus on and say, why do I believe that? What's the evidence for it? And should I believe it? And why would a person who's as intelligent or more than me not believe that, even if you think it's the bedrock of your whole existence? And some people find that very unsettling, that you could question some fundamental, like, like core, that there is a self, that there is a physical reality, that there is a God, that whatever, that consciousness is real. It can be very unsettling. So I think that part of this, this exercise is enlightening, in that deep sense of enlightening, that it teaches you not only about yourself, but about just something deep about our place in reality, seeing things from other people's point of view. And it sounds kind of like something casual you just say, seeing it from that point of view, but actually doing it is very difficult. Entering into another person's worldview seriously is very challenging.
Richard Brown is a philosopher at the City University of New York and an adjunct professor in the psychology program at LaGuardia Community College. He has done very important work in the philosophy of mind, consciousness studies, and the foundations of cognitive science, and he has broad interest across all sorts of areas of philosophy. He has thought a ton about the higher order thought theories of consciousness, although that doesn't mean that he's a strict proponent of the higher order thought theories of consciousness, and we'll come to see what that exactly means here. Here we do a deep dive into the higher order thought theories. We take a look at some of their particularities, some variants, what it means to experimentally test them and what the work there looks like. We talk about things like animal consciousness. We take a look at some of the implications that come out of higher order thought theories. So we take a look at what higher order thought theories tell us about emotions, what they tell us about well-being, and other topics. Here is my conversation with Richard Brown. So how did you get interested in consciousness studies and the higher order theories specifically?
Yeah, so it's kind of, I didn't expect to end up in that area. I guess I was always interested in consciousness. And when I took a philosophy of mind course, I happened to take it at a time when the Block and Flanagan and Guzeldor, if that's how you say his name, I apologize, I'm missaying it, but the consciousness philosophical debates, that big anthology that came out in 97 or 98. So I happened to take a class right when that book was being published, and the professor that taught the class used that book in the class. So that was my first real exposure to to philosophy in the contemporary sense, because prior to that, my education had largely consisted of, the classical authors. And I thought of philosophy as kind of something like kind of like dinosaurs, something that used to be around and people did, and then like it's ancient history. It's not something people still do. I didn't realize that. And so it was that book. I guess it was 98 or something like that, 1998, where we were reading that book, and I was like, wait, these people are still alive. They're talking about like current things, and so I became aware that there was more than this historical discussion. And you know in my meetings with the philosophers in the other classes, consciousness hadn't really come up. Like, mind brain identity had come up, and personal identity had come up, and mental content, and these other things. But you don't really get a presentation of the hard problem of consciousness, something like that you can recognize in at least Western authors in the history of philosophy. So that really drew me in, was finding out that this was something that was currently going on, and I realized that understanding the brain seemed really important to this project. And here was a group of people arguing about what the mind was, and no one in the room really knew anything about what the brain was doing. And that was kind of when I decided that I needed to go and take some classes in neuroscience as well. And that's what I started doing. I started taking the biology classes and any class that I could that the professor would let me in, even though I was a philosophy major. I started taking all the bio and psychology classes that dealt with the brain, because I had this idea that if you want to talk about the mind, you should know something about the brain. I found out that's kind of a controversial idea, actually. And in the history of psychology and neuroscience, it hasn't always been very obvious to people doing it that was something that should be done. Anyway, so how did I get interested in consciousness specifically? I wasn't at first. I was interested in mind-brain identity. And that's really what the issue that I was really interested in, was the identity theory of the mind. And of course, consciousness is there because it's the identity between conscious aspects of the mind and the neural functioning or neural states. But it wasn't really the problem of consciousness that drew me in. It was trying to think about the metaphysics of the mind, generally speaking, and how something mental could be physical. And that was really the kind of question that sucked me in. And at that time, when I heard about the higher order theory of consciousness, I sort of thought it was obviously false. Like the first time I ever heard it, we read a paper by David Rosenthal, and I was just like, this can't be right. I'm thinking about that rock over there, and it doesn't do anything to the rock. And that's a kind of knee-jerk reaction that I found out a lot later is the wrong reaction. If the theory is wrong, it's wrong for other reasons, not for those kinds of reasons. But when I first encountered it, I was like, yeah, this doesn't, this version of the theory doesn't make sense. Even though I did recognize that the idea that consciousness as inner awareness had some intuitive pull. And that seemed to resonate with me. But I remember like back then just being very confused by representationalism and what the difference was between first order theories and higher order theories, and all of those kinds of ways of dividing the landscape only became clearer a lot later at that time when we read like a paper by Daniel Dennett. He's talking about quieting qualia. I just thought, this is the most bizarre thing I've ever heard of, like someone trying to say that there's no such thing as consciousness. It's only much later that you realize, oh, this is like, some theoretical construction of the thing that he's railing against or whatever. But at the time I was just like, Descartes never even got that far. He never doubted I am conscious. So Dennett had taken this kind of doubt to what seemed to me like an impossibly radical conclusion. So what drew me in, so at the beginning, then it was more these metaphysical questions. And then, I started taking classes with people that talk about higher theories like David Rosenthal and Austin Clarke, and just realizing that there's a lot of interesting things to talk about there, and that there's a lot of ways to misunderstand the theory. So it was a theory that as I learned about it, it started to make sense to me. Not in the sense that I could believe that it was true, but in the sense that I understood like the different parts of it and how you could like construct a theory like that in enough detail that you could empirically check to see maybe if it was on the right track. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to look at theories that made empirical predictions that maybe could be empirically tested or falsified. And in the course of doing that, it turns out there's a lot of complicated issues that arise. And I don't really think of myself as someone who is like a true believer of higher order theories. I just think that they deserve to be empirically tested um, in a way that is fair to them, because a lot of times they're misunderstood, it seems to me, because you can dismiss them with a one-liner, oh, there's no inner awareness required. I'm just aware of the world. So I do think that there's a lot of conceptual issues there that are worth working out, but I wouldn't say that the higher order theory is something that I like truly believe. It could be true, and if it were true, I'd be pleasantly surprised. I'd be like, wow, okay. I don't have a track history of like being right about these things, so it'd be a bit of a surprise to me.
Of course, I mean, you don't have to commit yourself to something. You can just say that you're interested in it as a curiosity and you want to explore that further.
Exactly. Well, I mean, some of these people out here are true believers, and they're like, how could anything else be correct? I don't classify myself in that category. I think it's an interesting idea that should be taken seriously, as seriously as these other candidates, like global workspace theory, um, attention-based theories, integrated information theory, some of the main kind of candidates that you hear in cognitive neuroscience. I think higher order theories should be recognized as in that group, as a serious contender for giving us at least a part of the empirical story about the nature of consciousness. Or they're ready to be falsified empirically. Either one would be progress for the science of consciousness.
Right. And the nice part is that it is in line with and working with and communicating with the relevant sciences.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's never like an easy empirical refutation, even like classic examples like water is H2O. There was no canonical experiment that definitively proved that water is H2O. In fact, if you look at the history of it, what you see is there was a big debate about that experiment where they took some water and then separated the hydrogen from the oxygen. And you get one tube where it comes out one way and the other one where it comes out the other way. People were suggesting something happened in the tube and it changed it. I mean, so there were different interpretations of that experiment besides just that there was a chemical bond that got broken, which became, the prevalent interpretation. But it wasn't as though those other interpretations were ruled out empirically. That was like wider theoretical considerations that had to come into play. So it's not as though we're going to have some definitive experiment that's going to say yes or no that this theory of consciousness is or isn't accurate, but rather what we want is a kind of a general set of predictions that the theory makes, which we can go and check to see whether we have reasonable reasons to think that this is the way things work or not, or whether we should revise or reject the theory. If someone really like digs their heels in, then they could always find some way to interpret the evidence or the data in a way consistent with some general outline from a theory. Like, for example, if you really think that higher order theories are wrong, and first order theories, by the way, as I use those terms, they just mean theories of consciousness which either require some kind of inner awareness in order to explain what it's like to be us, or which don't require a kind of inner awareness. So first order theories say, well, you don't need any inner awareness of your own mind in order to experience the world. You just need some state that puts you in touch with the world external to you, and then you got to spell out like what the state is like or something like that, how it actually works. But if someone's really committed to that view, then whatever the empirical evidence comes back, they can always find a way to say, oh, well, maybe there's some other way in which this first order representation's got to be implemented, or maybe this or that condition has to be met. So real diehard committed persons, and by which I mean someone who's already really deeply committed to a certain theoretical outlook, they can always find a way to accommodate that outlook. So I think it's better actually to sort of have a not necessarily non-committal, but an open-ended commitment, such that you could be swayed by the empirical evidence uh, in a reasonable way, a non-ad hoc way, responsive to the empirical data, rather than trying to always interpret data through a certain theoretical lens.
Right. Seems like the healthy thing to do.
Yeah, you'd be surprised.
Right. So then that's kind of the formal takeaway from higher order theories, that for a state to be conscious, the subject needs to have some sort of internal awareness of being in that state.
Yeah, well, so it actually turns out that start how you start things off is going to matter. Not everyone who thinks of themselves as a higher order is going to agree with every given characterization. So the way I think of things, yes, a higher order theory is one where some kind of inner awareness is required. Um, yes, there might be people who would disagree with that characterization, though, because once you get into the details, like for example, some people might think, look, higher order theories are ones that say you could have unconscious mental states. And so these are ones which you're not aware of as being in any sense, maybe mental states which you have no awareness of. And then that's kind of required in order to be a higher order theory. It's not just that there's that whenever you're conscious, there's a state of inner awareness, but also that's kind of detachable in a sense from the state. And I think that second thing is an optional claim. It could be the case that every mental state is conscious in virtue of having some kind of inner awareness around, and there's no unconscious mental states. So I wouldn't want to define a higher order theory as one that's committed to the existence of unconscious mental states, although it's certainly compatible with that. But that's why I want to emphasize that it's the inner awareness which is doing something. And then the different kinds of higher order theories are going to be distinguished by the kind of inner awareness and what kind of relation, what they think awareness is. So if you think of awareness as a kind of perceptual relationship, then you have higher order perception theories say that this higher awareness is sort of perception like, and that what you're doing is sort of perceiving your own mental life. That's John Locke's famous phrase, consciousness is the perception of what passes in a person's own mind. So that's a way of thinking of that. And then you get Kant's talking about inner sense. You have the outer sense and you have the inner sense by which you are aware of your own mental functioning. So that's one way of thinking about that. I think that for a while that was less popular. It's becoming, some people are reviving that way of thinking, at least ways that are somewhat similar to that sort of view. On the other hand, you might think awareness involves a sort of cognitive state, like thinking, that you can have states of awareness that make you aware of things which are thought-like. And so you might think of the inner awareness as a kind of cognitive representational thought-like state, less like a perception and more like, thinking Chicago is in America. So it's got intentional concepts. And then you have to tell a story about what concepts are and how they relate. So it can get quite complicated. But then on the other hand, you might say, look, it's a little bit, that's the wrong way to think about inner awareness. Inner awareness has got to be something more direct, more like acquaintance. So maybe inner awareness can't be these more familiar states like perception or cognitive states, ones that you could understand in a more straightforward cognitive science sort of way. Perhaps they're like this more heavy duty notion of being acquainted with the thing. So that when you have a conscious experience of red, it's like you being acquainted with the first order state. So then you have a bunch of different ways that you could go. But the key issue seems to be how you think about the nature of awareness, in particular in this role that is playing in this theory. And there's lots of different ways you could think about it, and arguments amongst each person, each camp about, this is the better way to think about it, and so forth and so on. So it's not straightforward. There's no real such thing as the higher order theory. There's kind of this general idea that inner awareness is going to play some role, and then you're off to the races about, okay, it's sort of the same about perception, right? We have this idea that perception is something that by which we're aware of the external world, and then there's a million theories of perception. So there's no like the theory of perception. There's this theory, that theory, perceptual content, or that even if there is perceptual content, it's just something that people debate. So I think it's somewhat similar in the case of the, and in fact, I think you get a lot of the same debates. I'm going way off on our tangent now, so stop me at any time here. But so in the philosophy of perception, you have a debate between so-called direct realists who think that our awareness is kind of a direct relation to some quality in the world, so that when I see a red apple, the redness is somehow a property of the apple, and my seeing it puts me in a direct awareness relation to the redness of the apple, which is out there on the apple. It's a property of the apple. So then, on the other hand, you have representationalist views that say, no, you're not in some direct relation to the redness of the apple, but rather you're in a state that represents that there's a redness of the apple. And then you have debates about hallucinations and illusions and what's really going on and what the intentional content is and how you could be aware of that and what all that means. And in a way, you get a similar sort of debate in the higher order camp over what the role of the first order state is going to be. So in the perceptual case, the question is whether there's some object in the world that you're directly related to, which has a property which determines what your conscious experience is like. Like the redness of the apple makes it that you experience red. It's just that you're aware of the redness of the apple that makes it an experience of the red. So there's two parts of it, the red and then you doing it. Whereas the representationalists think somehow there's the state which represents the redness, and that is your experience of it, so that it's not really you in relation to some property of the object, but you're in this other representational relation to some intentional content, which is the way in which you represent the thing. So that same debate transfers in a way to the higher order theories of consciousness when you think about like the first order state, which you could think of as representing the redness in the environment, and then your inner awareness of that first order state, which you think of as playing some role in you having the conscious experience, if you're a higher order theorist. So the question would then amount to what is the role that the first order state plays? So one camp might be sort of like akin to the direct realist, and they would say, well, the first order state has some property, and the higher order state simply makes you aware of that property, so that what it's like for you is determined by a combination of the first order state having this property and you being aware of that property in some kind of direct way, maybe like pointing or something, that one. And that would be akin to the direct realists who think that we're in some kind of direct relationship to the property out there, except now it's property of the first order state, as opposed to a property of the apple itself. So there's the apple, its properties, and then our first order state, which represents those properties, and then our inner awareness, which makes us aware of the first order state. So it's basically the same sort of view, but moved into the mind. Whereas you have a different sort of higher order theorist who wants to say, no, the first order state itself doesn't play that role, because it's the inner awareness, which we could think of as a representational state, representing you as, for example, seeing red. And it's that state which makes it the case that what it's like for you is seeing red. It's because it's representing with a certain intentional content. I am seeing red. So the reason that you experience redness is because you represent yourself as seeing red. The first order state doesn't do anything in that explanation in terms of contributing to your experience. It's just in the same way that the representationalists and perception think that, well, the apple doesn't have to be there. You could hallucinate the apple and have the same experience. So the physical apple is not playing a role in making up the content of your experience. So too, this version of higher order theory says the same thing. The first order state doesn't play that role. It's the higher order state itself, which completely determines the nature of your experience. So the two different versions of higher order theory would sort of split over whether they think the way the mental functioning at the first order level, whether it plays any role in making it be a certain way for you from the inside.
So in that cap, are you imagining now? There's one imagining that you have a first order state, and then there's some sort of mechanism that takes you to a higher order state, or how is it that higher order states arise in this?
So there could be lots of reasons. So one version of this, which is due to Hakuan Lao, is that there's got to be some kind of system that does what he calls perceptual reality monitoring. So if you specifically think about this in terms of like neural functioning, then the argument kind of runs as follows. Suppose that you are some, group of neurons in the prefrontal cortex. Well, then you have a bunch of neurons coming from the visual areas projecting to you, and you are getting signals from them. And we know that there is a kind of baseline rate of firing, so that's just background noise. And sometimes those visual neurons will fire because they're relaying information about the external environment. So that's signal telling you that there's an apple or whatever's out there. And then sometimes you're having a hallucination or a dream, and those same neurons are firing. So if you're just thinking about the general way in which this works, it sort of seems like somewhere in the brain, there's got to be a system which is in charge of determining whether or not some given set of neural firing is noise, so it should be ignored, or is it really relaying information about the external world, or is it a hallucination, or another mental imagery or some other non-veridical set of firing. So what he thinks is that there's got to be something that does that, because from the brain's point of view, well, this is a very meaningful distinction. There's always these signals coming around, so you got to somehow figure out which ones are meaningful and which ones should be ignored and which ones are internally generated. So that's a general argument that you're going to want to have some kind of system that's doing this. And then you could give an argument from computer science that they have these general adversarial networks or whatever, that's these generative adversarial networks where they have a thing trying to produce it and then something trying to predict it. And this has been very successful. So you could run that kind of argument. On the other hand, you could just say, who knows why? The psychology is many and varied, and all sorts of causal connections are going on. And I think the traditional story is that if you kind of started with creatures that never had this sort of inner awareness, then you would have to sort of figure out how they could get it. And like David Rosenthal has told one version of this. He says, imagine that there's some ancestor of a chipmunk that, I assume chipmunks are conscious. But imagine there's some ancestor of a chipmunk that wasn't conscious. So X hypothesis, let's suppose it doesn't have higher order states, just because we're thinking about that theory. Not, just for fun. So the squirrel, according to this version of the theory, could have all sorts of first order states and function in a way that you would recognize from Ned Block's paper called Super Blindsight, which is a fictional version of Blindsight, where a person is behaviorally adept at getting around the world but has no conscious experience. For people who don't know, you can go on YouTube and Google a video of a monkey named Helen, who had the occipital lobe of the brain removed bilaterally on both sides. In other words, the part of the brain that does the at least the primary visual processing, the first stop into the cortex. And Helen can navigate around an environment, feed herself, grab target food from different locations. In other words, guide her behavior on visual information. So that's a kind of blind sight. which is unusual. But there's one rare case of this in humans as well. It turns out this guy TN people often talk about. But anyway, we don't need to talk about that stuff unless you want to. The point that I'm trying to make is we can imagine a case where a person has no, I mean, a chipmunk has no conscious experience, but all of these behavioral abilities because it has first order states, but no inner awareness of those first order states. So one way of asking your question would be like, how does an animal like that ever come to have higher order states? Why would they ever show up? So one answer might be, well, there's some function or benefit that's added. And that's a typical answer, that somehow monitoring the system gives you more control over the system. That's a pretty typical answer from people who like higher order theories, that re-representing or modeling the first order behaviors as the system's behavior is a way of controlling or predicting what it's going to do itself. So that's useful. But on the other hand, you might say, look, there's just no benefit for this. It comes about because, perhaps the chipmunk was chasing for a certain acorn, and its visual system was representing it as being reddish brown. And then when it gets closer, its visual system represents it as being green. And the chipmunk spontaneously notices that the way that it experienced the what was it, acorn? I forget what my example was different in these two cases. So then it comes to just have the concept of these mental qualities, so that it could happen spontaneously by noticing errors in one's experience. In other words, you simply come to notice that, oh, the way I thought this was isn't the way it was, and thereby acquire the concept of these kinds of first order states. If one came to apply these things regularly and reliably, then that would be the emergence of consciousness, according to this theory. So as usual, there's a lot of ways you could go. So why would a higher order states ever arise? It could be that there's some usefulness to it. So that's why. It could be that there's no usefulness to it, and there's some other story that this is a spandrel, something else that just happened. Yeah, there's lots of reasons.
Right, that makes sense. On the other side, then, on the representational higher order theories, do you generally find yourself more attracted to that side?
Yeah, I mean, so I've developed a version, or tried to develop a version of higher order theory that I could understand. And so I call that the higher order representation of a representation, which when I began, I thought it was kind of just your standard higher order theory. And then people start telling me no. So I was like, well, it's a version of the theory that at least I can understand. So I'll call it the horror theory. Simply because that's what I think is important, is that it's a representational theory of consciousness. And what I found in my own educational trajectory was that people would always tell you that higher order theories are representational theories of consciousness. That's in every introductory text. Higher order theories are representational theories come in two kinds, first order ones and higher order ones. And then they go on, and then they don't really treat them like representational theories, or at least it didn't seem to me, because representational theories are kind of well known in first order circles. There's Michael Tye's panic theory, and where to have a representation that's conscious in the right way is to have it have it abstract and poised in the right way and have a certain content, blah, blah, blah. So, people have talked about what kinds of content and how it doesn't have to match the world. And so there's a whole debate about representationalism. And it just seemed to me that higher order theories were not really connected to that debate, even though people were going around saying they are a version of that kind of theory. So I set out trying to say, well, okay, well, if you wanted to say the theory in those terms, what would you say? And that basically amounts to taking the idea of inner awareness and casting it as a kind of representation of one's own mind, so that makes it a way of trying to spell out in some detail what you mean. Because then you can say, well, what do you mean by a representation? And what do you mean by a representation of something that's mental? And how are these things going to actually be implemented in a neural system like ours? And then you get all the questions that arise. So myself personally, I wouldn't say I'm most attracted to that view. But what I would say is that I think that it should be taken as seriously as the other ones. And it's the one that's most often dismissed right out of hand. Because in effect, what it says is that when you experience red, that simply is an occurrence of a kind of like thought-like state to with something like the content, I am seeing red, which has a lot in common with your ordinary thought. When you think like I'm seeing red, or that thing is red, or there's a red thing there, if you think that thing's red, then you're thinking about the object. So you're aware of the object there, in this case. If you think I'm seeing red, then you're aware of your seeing. So the idea is that the thought counts as a kind of awareness. The thought is a kind of representational state. And so my idea was, well, gee, I don't know if it's a thought or not, but it's a representational state. And the representational state will have concepts. And the concepts, we could talk about what kind of concepts figure in that state and how they relate to the experience according to the theory. And then what you would expect to find or not find according to this view. And so it straightforwardly predicts that you're going to get kind of mismatch cases, which is where I think where all the experimental results pay off.
Right. So, just for people listening, would you mind going into that a bit further? So, what has the experimental record of finding cases of mismatch and then fitting them into that theory? What has that been like?
Yeah, so there hasn't really been much of a record yet because, I mean, I don't know how much of this anyone cares about, but in my opinion, there has been a large misunderstanding of like what the traditional version of the higher order theory says. And therefore, people have sort of misunderstood how you go about testing it. Some people really like the quote unquote misunderstanding, and it has become its own version of the theory, which I described as that relational version of the theory early. But like, at least in the way that like David Rosenthal first presented, because he's kind of the main defender of this in modern times. If anyone's knows, he taught to graduate center for many years, but he's really done a lot of work trying to make higher order thought theories, this version where it's cognitive thought, like say, taken seriously. And there were other people who had, David Armstrong's another famous philosopher who was a higher perception guy, but since that time, there's been kind of a lot of ways of going, but the kind of way that many people have thought the theory goes is just that there's this first order state, then you have an awareness of it, and somehow the awareness of it makes the first order state the conscious state, so that this thing, like, it lights up, it turns on, it starts glowing with the phenomenal quality of redness or whatever. And if you have that version of the theory in mind, then you're going to go and try and find what you think of as the first order state, which is already hard to define in neural terms. But let's suppose that we think it's in the visual cortex. Then you're going to think that what you want to find the conscious states are going to be in the neural cortex. And in a way, the conscious state is ambiguous on the higher order theory because you're aware of the first order state. So that is the state that's conscious in the sense of you being aware of it. But what it's like for you to be in the state is determined by the higher order state. And that's kind of always confused people. So if you wanted to know what the experience of the person was like, you would look for the higher order state. If you wanted to know which state the higher order state was representing, so which state the person was aware of, you'd look for the first order state. So, so people have not really separated those two views out. It's only recently that people have started to sort of say, no, I officially declare I'm the one or I'm the other. For many years, there was just like people thought there was just this one version of the theory, um, because the idea that it could all just be this higher order thought like state is a very bizarre view, that the experience of red is just like similar to a belief in this way, because they seem very different. I mean, my belief that things are red and my experience of redness um, seem from the inside to be somewhat different. I would say they both have experiential attributes. But anyway, so the point though is that on the version which doesn't allow the first order state to play the role in making it the experience change, you're going to have cases, or at least it seems conceptually possible that you would have cases where you have the first order state representing red and the higher order state representing something else like green. And that was kind of a traditional objection to the higher order theory when it first came out. Like, what do you say? Is it like red or like green? Is it the first order state that makes it like red? So if the first order state represents red and the higher order state says, I am seeing green, then it sort of seems like you have a choice to make. Like, which way, what is the person experience? So you could say, well, nothing happens. It's too weird of a case. You could say it's like what the first order state says, like it's seeing red. Or you could say it's like what the higher order state is like seeing green. And so people thought this was a kind of objection to higher order theories. And my strategy has been to try to argue that this is not an objection. It's just a rather surprising empirical prediction. So it's a kind of a consequence of the theory that you should be able to find cases like this. So let's experimentally try to set up those kinds of cases and see if we have any of that kind of evidence. As of yet, that's not really been done. Instead, what has been done is people who like this theory have looked at experimental work already done and try to interpret that work in these terms, whereas the other side has interpreted it in their terms. And what you have is like the experiments that are currently done, like King's blindness experiments and Sperling. If we want to talk about those, we can. But these various things that people have done, they weren't done to test this theory. But instead, people want to try to take that and interpret it and say, well, it's consistent with my theory, but it's consistent with the other one too. And so we've kind of argued to a stalemate. So it seemed to me that what you want to do is say, look, no, what we want is that to admit, first of all, that this is what the theory predicts, that in fact you could experience red without the first order state at all if you set things up in the right way. Now, first order states are going to be required in some sense causally to produce like the higher states or to give you the concepts or whatever. But if you invented a hypothetical thing, which I call a brain clamp, similar to a voltage clamp, where a voltage clamp is a neuroscience tool that allows you to keep a neuron clamped at a certain voltage so you can like test your various ideas about what ion channels do and so forth and so on. But if you could keep the first order activity clamped to a certain level, like at a constant level, and you could vary the higher order states, then according to this version of the theory, you would vary the conscious experience of the person. But because it doesn't matter in any way what the first order stuff is doing, it in terms of what it's like for the person. So that seems somewhat surprising, in fact, counterintuitive, that you could like be experiencing red even when your first order states were, representing purple or the sound of an oboe or anything at all, actually. And your behavior would be attuned to those first order states. So first order state is one that, makes you aware of the external world. And by aware, we mean, informationally responsive, that you can do stuff. So if you have a first order state representing that something's purple, then you're going to behave in ways that suggest that you think that is purple. Like, for example, pressing a button, saying it's purple, classifying it in certain ways with the more blue things and less like the red things, and so forth and so on. Even all the while, we might say you go around saying that it's, red and experiencing it as red, so that the higher order theories typically want to cleave off these two different aspects. The first order states driving the behaviors, and the higher order states responsible for consciousness and whatever functionality consciousness may have. So on that's a debate. So some higher order theorists think it has none, whereas like I think it has some. So I think that the higher order states, if they work in this way, um, will have an effect on the first order states, which keeps them active in the cognitive system. So you could think of it as like by becoming aware of the first order state, you now have the ability to send it to working memory, to direct attention to it. Um, uh, it can be routed for further processing so that you can figure out, more of the details or whatever. So, whereas states that you're not aware of are going to fade away more rapidly, on my view, and not be around for this sort of selection and entering into the global workspace and all that other stuff that people talk about. So I do think that the consciousness has a function, namely that the higher order state has a function. But I don't think the phenomenology part has a function. I don't think that what it's like for you is doing that. It's just another aspect of the higher order state. So as far as predictions are concerned, then so if you wanted to test these different versions of higher order theory, you would want to find cases where you could disassociate the activity of the higher order element and the first order element, and then see whether you get these mismatches. So a relational version of higher order theory is going to end up saying, look, if you vary the first order state, then you're going to change the experience of the person. Whereas on the kind of view that I was just talking about, the horror theory, changing the first order state isn't going to change, as long as you can keep the higher state same, that is. It's not going to change the experience of the person. So there's an empirical prediction. If you could figure out how to set up a case where you could change one or, expect a difference at one, not the other, then you could differentiate these. And the same is true for, various first order theories and so on and so on. So I don't think, again, just like I was saying at the beginning, I don't think any of these are going to be like a knockdown, conclusive demonstration. But, within normal science, that's not what you ever get. But it would still be pretty surprising if the theory says, look, you could have an experience of a face even if your fusiform face area were damaged or missing, and then you could show that, in fact, that is the case. So first of all, you'd have to be relatively confident that that was like the first order area where face representations or activity was located, which is hard to do, it turns out. And then you would want to have, so that would be very surprising. So that's what you would like. You want a theory that makes a surprising prediction. So that's cool. So I don't look at it as an objection. I look at it as like, as long as you can spell out the details, which is really hard, but assuming you could, then you have something that could actually be empirically tested. And rather, so in a way, I don't want to get all grandiose or anything, but in a way, it's sort of similar to like how I would view the EPR paradox in quantum mechanics, where it's like they wrote that paper as an objection, they were like, this is ridiculous. Look what would happen if your ridiculous quantum mechanics was true. And then they said, well, experimentally, let's test it. And yeah. So rather than simply a philosophical objection, it became a testable hypothesis that actually ended up supporting the original theory. And that's sort of in a way what I would like to see these misrepresentation cases be used as to say, look, you think it's an objection that this weird thing could happen, but let's go look. If it's weird, then it should be sort of refutable easily, right? So what are you waiting for? The problem with higher order theories generally is that they were formulated by philosophers, and especially by philosophers who weren't really interested in the brain at that time. So they're formulated at this total psychological level. It talks about awareness and first order states of awareness and higher order states of awareness. But how does that relate to what the brain is doing? So you need a whole separate set of arguments to say, well, okay, so where in the brain would that be? And it's not really clear that we know where in the brain any of these things would be. Although we have hypotheses. And so I think that you can say, well, if this is what you think they are, then you can look for it there. And if this is what you think they are, you can look for it there. But I don't think you're going to get anything more than that at where we're at right now.
The long-standing challenges of combining conceptual and empirical work.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just to like illustrate this more concretely, like we've been talking about first order states and saying they're states of the awareness of the world. So where would you find those in the brain? Well, you might think it's obvious that if it's a visual state, it would be in the visual cortex, maybe. Um, but where in the visual cortex? Is it in V1, V2, V3, V4? Is it only the mid-level areas that matter, like some people would say, or are the states in these other areas relevant? Or perhaps, like global workspace theorists think, this first order states are the ones that are globally broadcast. They're the ones, the states that count as awareness of things in the environment are the ones in the global workspace. So maybe and that would be states all the way in the prefrontal cortex and the parietal cortex. So they're well out of the visual cortex by the time they're in the workspace, one would think, depending on how you spell out the details of what being in the workspace means. So the point is that you might even think that first order states are in the front of the brain, as opposed to back here. It depends on what first order states are. So first order states are defined pretty clearly as awareness of things in the external environment, as opposed to awareness of my own mind. But then, yeah, well, gee, you could even be like a Denenian, a Dennett person who thinks, there's no mapping from the mental states to the brain states, because these are like theoretical posits that are useful and describe the person, but that aren't neurologically real in any sense. They're just, what you have is a bunch of stuff happening in the brain, and then it's useful for us to describe it as, oh, here's a thought, there's a belief. But, anyway, so there's a whole range of views you could have about the relation of these psychological states to the neural states. And a lot of other theories of consciousness are like made up by scientists, and so are explicitly put in terms of like this part of the brain, that part of the brain. And the higher theory isn't exactly like that, so it allows for a lot of variation. I think it's not really that unusual, though, if you realize that first order theory simply means theory where inner awareness is invoked. And so there's tons of those kinds of theories. IIT, integrated information theory, is a first order theory. Global workspace theory is a first order theory. Michael Tye's panic theory is a first order theory. So, what unites those theories is simply that they deny a role for inner awareness. So there's a ton of different versions of first order theory, just like there's a ton of different versions of higher order theory. It's just that people haven't really paid attention, because most people don't make it past that knee-jerk reaction where they just go, this is what? We don't need that for consciousness, which is the reaction I had as well, by the way. But it just turns out that if you think about it more, I think that there's more interesting things. But I would love it if it were empirically disconfirmed. I mean, if it came back that this was wrong, then I'd be like, that's fantastic. So it wouldn't really bum me out. I don't really have, I sort of still think that, well, even though I don't think the higher order theories are like obviously false, I sort of think that they're intuitively weird. And also that every theory of consciousness is kind of a bit strange. So, something a bit strange is probably going to be weird, be true at the end of the day. And the higher theory should be counted amongst the strange views that we take seriously. I mean, if they're should be taken as seriously as any other of our theories of consciousness, which they often aren't.
Right. I think it's really, really important to not feel like you have to identify with something and be a true believer, and just say you're interested in something, right? Like, I think that really, really holds us back when you have to tie yourself in so strongly with something you're just curious about.
It's true. I agree. Yeah, there's a lot of pressure to like identify with a camp. And people always like saying, you're a higher order theorist. And like, to me, you're a higher order guy, right? It's like, well, I think it's an interesting approach. But yeah, I don't want to think of myself as like a higher order person. I think of myself as like a highly skeptical person who is deeply confused about a lot of these issues. And I have like, intuitions or convictions, but often I find myself arguing about these things as ways of trying to figure out what I myself think about things, by arguing with people smarter than me and saying, well, here's what I thought was the case. Now tell me why it's wrong. Like, show me where And then I ended up changing my mind. So I feel like when I first got into this stuff, I thought that certain things were obvious. Like I said, I thought this when I first read this paper, I was like, this is obviously false. That was my immediate reaction because I sort of thought that you could tell which things were obviously false by your immediate reactions. Now I don't think that. I think that I had an experience of like getting to a point where I realized that I understood enough about philosophy and science to recognize that we weren't anywhere near having good answers. So that what we're trying to do is like explore the territory of what might count as a good answer because we're not sure. So we don't want to limit ourselves because, and that's why, panpsychism was on the table and the things that a lot of people might ridicule, I find um, worthwhile to think about because I really don't think that we have a good grasp on this stuff. We gotta wait for GPT-5. They don't know.
The Twitter posts. But panpsychism specifically, what have you found useful in the conversations that have occurred around it in recent years?
Well, I think that for me, my background commitment to physicalism has always centered on the quest to understand mental causation. And while I understand that epiphenomenalism is a conceptual possibility and there's all sorts of like logically possible scenarios where consciousness doesn't have kind of a role to play in producing behavior, I just find it intuitively tremendously compelling that the mind causes physical things and that physical things cause mental things. Compelling enough to the point where I think that a theory which made that the case is a better theory than one that doesn't. And you could debate about that, and there's tremendous debate, whatever. So, but that's my own assessment. So, in fact, the traditional case against dualism kind of centers on how does the mental causation work, which I don't think is fatal to traditional dualism, by the way. But anyway, it's a good starting case. So that's why I was always attracted to the identity theory. And I didn't really like functionalism very much. I've kind of become more friendly to functionalism in my old age, but in my early days, I was like, no, functionalism bad. But functionalism probably okay. Anyway, so the identity theory gives you the most satisfying view. If the mind is the brain, then mental causing physical is just physical causing physical. So physical causing mental is just physical causing physical. So, or mental causing mental, depending on, how you want to do these things. So I used to spend a lot of time thinking about the identity theory and, being upset that people would say that, posit these identities and then treat them as though they're distinct. In musical theory, that happens a lot, by the way. People recognize that like, G flat and A sharp are the same note, but that it's useful to treat them as distinct. And then you get people saying, no, they're not the same note. They're just enharmonically identical, which means they sound the same, but they're different notes, don't you know, because they're in different scales and they appear in different contexts. So great. So it's useful sometimes to treat the things as distinct, even though we recognize that they're really the same thing in some set. Or even, I don't know, musicians might debate me about whether they're really the same thing. As far as the sound goes, they're really the same thing. So there's only one sound there. Anyway, so it's kind of interesting when you get into this debate. And that's how I was thinking about the identity theory, is that there's only one thing there, the mental state, which is the brain state. And then like what I found is that people will maybe say stuff like that, but not really take it seriously, like that there is the same thing, that they still want to preserve them as distinct. So I spent a lot of time talking about that, but the main motivator for accepting that view was the mental causation stuff. And functionalism, I was, always kind of puzzled by how you get the same view, because it's the abstract state, which is what the mental state is, right? Not the implementation of it. So, and there's a whole bunch of debates about that. I'm not trying to say that's a knockdown argument or anything, but it was something I always was puzzled by. So I always thought identity theory was the best view. If you want to explain how the mind and the brain interact, it's just they're the same thing. So no problem. Um, so yeah, I know you asked me about panpsychism. I didn't forget. But how does panpsychism come in? Is because it showed in a kind of clear way, I think, that there can be a non-physicalist version, which gives you a kind of mental causation in the same sort of way. Um, I mean, I even like quantum versions of dualism because they allow the mind to like play a role in collapsing the wave function. Although they don't give the mind much control over the outcome of the collapse, they do allow that it has some causal effects. So I even think, those aren't bad views. But anyway, so if you take the modern version of panpsychism, which says, okay, so physics tells us what these things do, but not what they are. So maybe what they are is consciousness. Well, then if the brain is composed of a bunch of physical states and those physical states really are consciousness, then when the brain does something, it's consciousness doing it. So if that identity is true, then you can understand why the mental state is having some physical effect. So making that, to me, that was the benefit of panpsychism. It made clear that you could have a version of this theory which is compatible with like what science says, which actually has precedent in history because physics has introduced new fundamental entities. The field is the big example, which everyone talks about. So maybe you need to postulate some fundamental entity, consciousness, and then see if you can explain it. So that's what I found useful about that discussion, was it opened up this discussion about what the causal role of the mind was and how a non-physicalist theory might try to account for that. I'm not saying it's successful because people will still ask questions about it. And there's still, objections, but that's why I think, where I get off. So, what the reason why I don't become a panpsychist and I still prefer physicalism, even though I don't have zero belief in panpsychism, by the way, I would say I have a little, a small amount of who the fuck knows classified as over there. So anyway, but the reason why I don't the needle doesn't point over there is because I just don't buy the arguments that are supposed to defeat physicalism, namely the a priori conceivability arguments. So I just think that it conditional on you finding that stuff defeating physicalism, then panpsychism is worth taking seriously. And what riles me up and makes me angry is when people act as though it's obvious that physicalism has been defeated or refuted. By the way, I don't believe in physicalism. Like I said, I'm a pretty skeptical person. What I believe is that physicalism hasn't been refuted by a priori arguments. So I think that we don't have a reason to think it's false, not a reason to think it's true. So, I don't know if physicalism is true, but I don't think that zombies or conceivability arguments about Mary and what she may or may not learn leaving a room tell us anything about the nature of consciousness. That's where I object. But if you find that that's sufficiently compelling, then I think panpsychism is a serious view. And, I don't know, the idea that consciousness is just a brain state is pretty mysterious, in the sense that some people have said, gee, I don't know how that could be the case. But other people have said, how could anything be the case? So I'm kind of in that camp. I don't know. Why is water H2O? It just seems like some things just are. And that's the way they are. And then what we do is figure out how they work and not why they are that way. I think that's a weird way to think about what science does, as telling us why. Aristotle thought about it that way, I would say. That Aristotle thought the job of science was to tell us why things have to be the way they are, necessarily, that they have to be this way. And then his answer was they have essences of a certain sort. And then you want to find out what those essences are. And then you know what the thing is because you know what makes it that way. In a way, it's kind of, echoing Plato, but in his Aristotelian way. So great, that's wonderful, but I don't really think of that as doing what science is trying to do, is tell us what the nature of things are. So a lot of this will boil down to what your views about philosophy of science are.
Right, right, right. There's these are all good points, but I think it's just sometimes a little frustrating when people want to knock down all of neuroscience or psychology or cognitive science, um, saying that they've failed. But I mean, these things are so new. Just give them some time, let them develop a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that the persons who are non-physicalists, who are really committed to that view, sort of don't see what you could discover that would change the way it is. So, I mean, I sort of get where they're coming from. It's the most general version of the argument is just that, you're going to learn about the structure and dynamics of the system, but consciousness seems to be somehow not involved with structure and dynamics. Um, and I agree that it seems that way. You could work yourself up into a rather dizzying flurry over this. And if you meditate or take the right drugs or have other sorts of experiences, it can become really compelling that, gee, well, something about this consciousness stuff that's unique and even feels fundamental, maybe. But the only question is whether you should take that face value. Or what reason we might have for thinking that this is misleading in some sense. So I don't even know if it's a matter of like needing more details or further science. I mean, obviously that would be great. But like my own view is that we should, like, what I call deprioritize the a priori arguments. And deprioritize, I sort of stole from the, war on drugs literature in America, where they were decriminalizing and deprioritizing enforcing certain rules, but they weren't making it illegal. So now things have changed somewhat, but they were for a moment, they were saying, look, it's not necessarily legal, but we're going to deprioritize it, which means we're not going to instruct police officers to enforce this rule. So it's as though it's still on the books, but we'll ignore it for a while, in essence. And I sort of thought, gee, that would be great to do, but with zombies. Zombies and Mary. Let's deprioritize those things in just this way. Let's not say they're worth nothing, but let's just put them on the shelf for a while because they're not telling us anything useful at the moment. I think at the moment what they're doing is telling you like what you already believed about consciousness and making it explicit. And the analogy that I sometimes use is sort of like going back to water. If you if you asked Aristotle what water was, he would say it's a simple substance with no parts. It's obvious. Like, look at it. And then if you said, yeah, but your water is like a substance made of hydrogen and oxygen and this bond and this chemical bond, he's like, no, there's no parts to water. And then suppose that Aristotle said, look, I know that your view is false because I can conceive of a world where there's water, but no parts. And then he said, so therefore, this has no parts. Well, you would kind of go, gee, that's great, but we know it does have parts. So there's got to be something wrong with your thinking that you can like conceive of this situation. You either have to say that you misconceived it in some way, or that this is just telling you sort of, it's giving voice to your own theoretical commitments in a way. So that the idea that I had was that in the fullness of time, if we knew everything, then the a priori arguments would be great because we could a priori deduce this stuff and know what's right. But that you have to know first already. So that I do think that this is the reason I started this rant because of your comment that you said we got to give the science time. So my first response was, well, maybe you don't. But then on the other hand, maybe you do because it's only after we sort of have answered a bunch of these other questions that we're going to be able to say with any kind of confidence that we should change the concept of consciousness such that it does have some functional connection, so that some connections are made, or that we see a way of making these connections a priori, or of recognizing that, dualism is right because these certain inferences can still be made even after you know all the details. So I do think that if in the end of time you could look at all the details and then know whether physicalism was true or false. But that requires like knowing everything about the brain and the way the world works in a way that we don't.
On the flip side, on the physicalist side, what do you take away from the other big consciousness theories? So, global workspace theory and IIT specifically.
Well, I think they're interesting and they could be right. So, uh, just like every other theory of consciousness, they have reasons for taking them seriously and reasons why they are taken as seriously as they are. And there are objections to them and reasons for wondering whether they are on the right track. So with global workspace theory, it's not 100% obvious to me what being globally workspace has to do with consciousness. I sort of know what it has to do with control of behavior and pushing buttons and walking around and stuff. But if that stuff can be done without consciousness, then which, that's an open question. But so it's not clear that there's any relation to consciousness at all. If these things can be done without consciousness, so then it becomes a big empirical question that you would want. And by the way, we don't know the answer to whether there's these forms of unconscious processing. A lot of people think there are, but it turns out really hard to try to nail it down. Anyway, so yeah, I don't think it's wrong, obviously, but I don't think it's right, obviously, either. So furthermore, I think that global workspace in particular has enjoyed some level of popularity because people take evidence for it that actually is ambiguous between different kinds of theories. So like higher order theories, for example. People say, well, look, when you see this consciously, there's activity in the frontal cortex. When you see it unconsciously, you don't get that activity in the frontal cortex. So this supports global workspace because global workspace says you got to have activity in the frontal cortex. But I'm simplified, but that's very vague. Because what kind of activity, what is it doing? So if that activity is a kind of inner awareness, then it's not being in the global workspace that matters, it's inner awareness. If it's being in the global workspace that matters, then we need to know the activity associated with that and look for it. So it seems to me that, some of these, the same can be true for like first order theories, like people who say re-enter processing, that it's not just feed forward from the visual area, but somehow higher order visual area is feeding back. Okay, great. But what does that feedback mean? Is it a kind of inner awareness? Is that the neurological signature of inner awareness? Some higher theorists have said maybe. Other people have said no. Other people have said, well, maybe the signal that you're seeing in global workspace theory is really a kind of back propagation from the higher order system that's correcting errors that you can get. So how to interpret what the activity we're seeing is open in all of these cases. So I don't really think you can, at this point, I don't think we can say that the global workspace theory is or isn't supported by this or that evidence without go looking at the details and say, have you ruled out this interpretation and that interpretation with respect to these higher order theories, which hasn't really been done. People haven't really, so this is the area where I think that should be done. Okay. My own kind of sneaking suspicion is that global workspace theory is a very good candidate for like giving you the states which you could be aware of, that the states that the higher order states represent are the states in the global workspace. But who knows? We'd have to wait and see. Now, as far as IIT, I think that's a different story because IIT tries to start from the nature of consciousness itself, so to speak, deduce some truths about that, then postulate some axioms on the basis of that. And therefore, a lot's going to depend on uh, the analysis of consciousness that you begin with. For example, one of their axioms is that consciousness is unified. That even though there's different parts of my experience, it's all somehow knit into one unified experience. And intuitively, maybe that's seemingly the case, but it's not obvious that it is the case, especially once you start to look at what's going on neurologically. Um, could there just be the appearance of unity? Is it maybe that we seem to have a unified experience, but maybe we don't? So I don't know what the answer to that question, but IIT assumes an answer to that question and then tries to build a theory of consciousness around it. So that to me seems to be you have to be very careful because it's not clear that these axioms should be universally accepted. So also, for example, they don't include anything about higher order awareness. So that they just say consciousness exists, consciousness consists of information and differentiation, blah blah. So there's various things, but nothing about inner awareness. So if higher order theories are on the right track, they just exclude them by fiat. So that seems to me to be something problematic. On the other hand, once you get to like their actual postulation that consciousness is integrated information, this again seems to me something that's more associated with the things we wouldn't want to call consciousness. So this, Ned Block has said this seems more like intelligence when you have information that's integrated in a way that allows control or whatever. I would want to say that this looks like what you would get from first order states. Like, why couldn't you have integrated information in first order states without any kind of inner awareness and therefore not consciousness? So just like with global workspace theory, I think that probably this is a candidate of what first order states are, which states we could be aware of, rather than a theory about what the nature of consciousness itself is. Plus, there's all sorts of weird stuff about IIT and the exclusion postulate, where they say that if there's integrated information and two systems have integrated information, then the system with the most integrated information is the conscious one, where the lesser one is not conscious. And that has the weird implication that you could become unconscious by becoming integrated to a system that was more conscious, more phi or whatever, as they put it. So, I think these theories are interesting, and they have led to some testable, they have tried to test some of these ideas. I think the kind of zip and zap stuff that they do, where they've used to try to figure out whether there's integrated information in like coma patients or persons in anesthesia by stimulating in a particular area and then measuring the spread of that stimulation and trying it as a way to try to determine how interconnected the various areas are and how much integration there is. It can give you some useful information. But I think that people who like IIT, when they talk about like a consciousness meter or building something that you could like use to determine whether a coma patient was conscious or something like that, I think we're a long way from that theory being able to do something like that, even if it were right, from being able to build something like that. So these other theories, I don't have as strong opinions about them as maybe some other people do, but I do kind of have strong opinions about people saying this one is, more empirically supported than that one or something like that, because I think that these theories are all supported to some degree or other by the empirical evidence, in the sense that there's no obvious contradiction with any of the empirical evidence. You can tell a coherent story from each of these points of view. So what's more important than developing the theories and cherry picking a bunch of data and saying, look, I'm consistent, is making a prediction that can then be tested. That say, here's what the theory says you should find, and then you should go and be able to find it, or confirm it or disconfirm it to some reasonable degree. Remember, nothing's knocked down and all that stuff. But so, I think that we're only just now starting to see this happening, actually, where people are recognizing that we've done enough theory developing. We have, this handful of big ideas that are at every conference. You're hearing about versions. It's like we got IIT, we have higher order theories, we have now higher order theories anyway in the last 10 years. We have theories based on attention. global workspace theory. But when you look at what these people are actually doing, what you find is that there's not a lot of crosstalk, and that each paper, which is presenting some evidence, is testing one of these theories using a particular methodology. And actually, when they did the analysis, they could determine which theory was going to be supported just by looking at the approach. So if they use like this change blindness approach, you can tell it's going to be like a global workspace theory and that they're talking about. Or if you use this other, so it's like these little silos of these theories where there's people that are interested in theory doing a certain kind of work uh, based on that theory, but there's not a lot of connection between the two, saying, hey, my theory says this, what does your theory say? Let's test them together jointly. And recently there's been some, attention to this exact issue of trying to get these guys together in some way to make joint predictions that can then perhaps narrow the field down or help us consolidate these ideas or somehow, move towards a standard model or a working model or some sort of general background assumptions about how these terms should be mapped onto the various empirical things. So, the Wild West is trying to be tamed. We'll see if they succeed or not. We're hopeful, but you never know. I mean, the Templeton Foundation is funding some of this research, and there's a big project with the IAT and global workspace theory. And, you can have your various feelings about Templeton one way or the other. Some people do, but all I can say is that they're willing to put up a lot of money to help try to accelerate these results. I mean, some people think this is a bit dangerous because it fosters the idea that there's like a definitive experiment by which you could prove or falsify these theories, and no one really should believe that, as we've been saying this whole time. But I still think that it's important to get people together, say, what does your theory actually say, and how is it different than his over there? And now, what would it mean about what we could test? And so that's promising, at least. Anyway, so you're asking me what I got out of these other theories. That's what I would say is that each one's interesting, but it's time for them to sort of get out and talk to other people more.
Yeah, the administrative side of studying consciousness is real weird. Like on one end, it feels like it should be its own field with people working together, but on another end, it seems like, well, no, these things are so complicated and they draw from so many different fields that you can possibly imagine how that would work. So it's difficult to imagine how you would blend these things together.
Yeah, exactly. So it's difficult. And that's why you sort of see it kind of split in the conferences. So we have the Arizona conference, the Science of Consciousness, and then you have the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. And they were sort of formed by mostly the same people at mostly the same time. But the difference between them was always kind of that one was, more inclusive and one was more cognitive neuroscience based in a sense. That one was focused more on the like normal science of the day, and one was like, would allow more exploratory approaches, quantum mechanics and, conscious universes and stuff. So in that sense, yeah, you can kind of see that there's this general broader field called consciousness studies where people are interested in these more general questions. And then the more narrow field of the cognitive neuroscience of consciousness, where what we're interested in is just using the models from neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience in particular, as we understand it now, can we generate a kind of model for what conscious experience is? And we have some of these things, maybe, I can't really think of a good one, but, think of something like deja vu, or, I don't know, whatever. We have a pretty good understanding of what might count as an explanation of that in terms of like unconscious processing, triggering of memories given some visual cue that you're not consciously aware of, and then you mistaking the sense of familiarity from the triggered memory with the thing that you're currently visually perceiving. So we have a set of cognitive mechanisms that we've developed in other areas, change blindness and implicit processing, unconscious processing, etc. Priming. So there's a bunch of stuff. And then we could use that in this other explanation. So that's kind of how I think of the cognitive neuroscience of consciousness. like we have a bunch of stuff that we've been talking about. We have representations, we have cognitive, we have theories of perception. Um, uh, Using those ingredients, can you say anything about consciousness? And that's what the theories that we have are trying to do. Outside of that are the theories which are more metaphysical in nature, which, like panpsychism, I sort of think of as compatible with any of these views in a way, because the panpsychist says, look, there's these fundamental things that are conscious, but then they have to be put together some way in a way that results in your consciousness. So maybe that has something to do with IIT, or maybe that has something to do with higher order theories, and maybe that has something to do with first order representations. Maybe some way when the brain becomes organized and thus in such a way, the little tiny ingredients are put together and thus in such a way. So I don't know, I'm not a panpsychist, but I think that even they could kind of just sit back and wait to find out what the ultimate neural correlate of consciousness was and say, yeah, great. And so that's going to be part of our explanation for why human consciousness is the way that it is. Um, Even though in order for there to be consciousness at all, you might have to postulate that the, quarks or fundamental elements are conscious in some fundamental sense. So I sort of see them as separate projects. One is dealing with I don't think science really deals with metaphysics. I mean, science, everything that neuroscience tells us could be true, even if idealism was true. So idealism just says, everything is mental, and then great. So we're studying the mental then. But it still might work like that for some reason. Yeah. So, yeah, sorry, I kind of trailed out there, but I got an email just binged in my ear and I was reading it. Sorry. But anyway, my point is that I think there's I was trying to say there's two separate projects, I think. And you were saying, it seems like these guys should work together. On the other hand, it seems like they're coming from such different areas. How could they work together? So I would say, yeah, it does seem like in one sense there's two separate projects. One, the metaphysics about the nature of reality. And does consciousness have some deep place in that nature of reality? And then the other one is like, given what we know about the brain, can we construct a theory which tells us something about, well, I would say human consciousness is where you want to start, but just consciousness in general would be great as well. And maybe you might think that they go together in some way, but I think they could largely be separated, in which case, the cognitive neuroscience of consciousness can kind of just proceed along, and the panpsychists and dualists of the universe can kind of just go, cool, and not really have any beef with it, because the real debate comes when you say, look, could you have that and lack consciousness? Is this like the necessary sufficient conditions for conscious experience, etc.? And there you get into all the other debates which are waiting, no matter what your ultimate theory about how the brain does what it does is. So I don't, by the way, just to sum this up, I don't think that it's an objection to panpsychism to say that it's not empirical or it doesn't make it predictions or something like that, because it's starting from the assumption that there's a piece of data which isn't explained, namely the existence of consciousness, and then postulates something to explain it. Whereas the physicalist starts from the assumption that you don't need that other thing. So, but they both agree that the science says the physical world works this way.
Yeah, I've definitely heard you talk about it before, but the stuff on human consciousness and animal consciousness, the scientific work on animal consciousness is very, very interesting. But I do find it kind of troubling when people conflate the science side of it and the moral side of it. Is that if you're waiting for science, if you're waiting for the science to be out to make moral decisions about how you should treat animals, then that's not a good strategy.
Yeah, it's not a good strategy. Exactly, because I mean, this is just a general feature I think about ethics, is that you don't want science to settle your ethical questions, because it might suddenly turn out. I mean, Peter Singer made this point a long time ago. He's not as popular, I guess, among some circles as he used to be, but he sort of made this point a long time ago. Look, if you think that people are equal, or that people should be treated in such a way, you get equal consideration, or however you want to define that, then you don't want to base that on some empirical fact about persons because you might find out it's wrong, and then you'd be committed to the claim that, oh, we're not equal. So this is kind of a moral claim. It's a different kind of claim. It says you should treat people equally, not that empirically we've discovered that they're equal or something like that. So, um, and I would say that yes, that's the right way to think about animals. Is it's sort of intuitively obvious that they're um, that deserve some moral consideration. You could debate how much and to what level, but I think that it's kind of to argue that they can that the pain of an animal should be taken in consideration to some degree or other. To seriously argue that is sort of insulting, and it's like I don't want to say like mind-boggling, out of touch with the reality, but something along those lines. But yeah, I meet people who want that. That's first you got to convince them that the pain of the animal matters, and then you got to go on and debate about all the rest of the stuff. And I just, or even that they do experience pain. I mean, even if they didn't, I think the precautionary principle, which says just to be safe on the safe side, assume so their behavior is too convincing. I mean, whenever I tell my students, did you know Descartes believed animals don't feel pain? Their reaction is almost like disbelief. They're like, how could anyone believe this? Then you could kind of go a long way to convincing them that we don't really know, by pointing out that, we're not dogs and they don't talk and so forth. But, Descartes' argument was if you built a dog robot that acted exactly like a dog in every single way, and if you were raised it's kind of a thought experiment where if you were raised like in a basement and you were a roboticist and you were just making these robot animals, and you made something that was indistinguishable from a dog in complexity of behavior, purely mechanically, and then you were let out of your basement and you went outside and saw a real dog, you would immediately conclude, oh, it's just like my mechanism. And you would immediately think, yeah, it's just a complicated mechanism. So it'd be, and then he had this other idea that mechanisms are not for consciousness, which some people might disagree with, obviously. But anyway, so he had an argument for why, a conceivability argument that if you could explain the behavior of the thing purely mechanistically, then you would become convinced that it wasn't conscious. Which, I guess since he was a dualist, makes sense. But some people might say, no, you just explain consciousness. Anyway, the point though is that I think that, yeah, first, you should just start from the kind of moral claim that they matter to some degree, but also that it's not pain that always matters morally, or even experience at all. I think other intentional states can matter just as much. So a lot of people have made the idea that, well, animals can have intentional states like desires, and frustrating their desires is bad in and of itself. And so I think that's true. So I think they feel pain and it's bad to frustrate their desires. But yeah, the science, but trying to figure out. So first of all, I wouldn't want to hang too much on the science of consciousness telling us that they do or don't feel pain. On the other hand, I do think it's an open empirical question. What would count as evidence that they do or don't feel pain? So especially the lower down you go. So if you have a certain kind of fish, for example, and the fish has a very simple brain, so it doesn't have like what we consider parts of the prefrontal cortex, doesn't have maybe even much of a cortex at all, but it still has the ability to sense damaging stimuli. So if you take a bee stinger and sting its lip, which seems kind of mean, but the fish will grimace and swim in a certain way and engage in a certain behavior. But you might wonder whether whether it's experiencing anything. Yes, it has the behaviors, but so do simple single cell organisms. If you drop acid on them, then they change their location, withdraw, etc. So, so the question of whether behavior is enough to know about conscious experience is a deep and vexing question. I think the answer is that it's not obvious that it is, but we don't have anything else to really go on in the case of animals. So of course, we find ourselves in this vexing position. The interesting thing is that you can kind of connect this to artificial intelligence, because we're sort of in a similar position there about what we count as evidence of them having conscious experience. So, my own position is to say we should start with humans first, so that the science of consciousness should proceed using humans, um, and to get a theory that we could kind of all agree on in the human case, and then to see what degree or other that theory can be extended to other animals and what kind of behavior that they have, which may lead us to believe that there are, different theories of consciousness for different organisms, or if we're really convinced by the theory of consciousness that the animals that lack consciousness. But like if you're a higher order theorist, for example, some people will say, "Oh, well, gee, then animals aren't going to have these cognitive states or these inner awareness states." To which I say, "Why? Why wouldn't they have them? I mean, if a chipmunk is conscious, by which I mean has experience, and if the higher order theory is true, then chipmunks have higher order states. Um, if you think that higher order states are too sophisticated for chipmunks to have, then you have a different version of what the higher order state is required. So, I mean, it's not obvious that they need some real deep sense of the notion of experience or heavy duty notion of concept or linguistic abilities. All of these things are assumptions about what concepts are and what it means to possess concepts. If you have a kind of, just a flat-footed psychological notion that having a concept means you can discriminate or sort things according to that, then it seems to me chipmunks do have concepts. They can sort things into acorns and not acorns. They have a concept of an acorn. Is it like our concept? No. Is it something they can linguistically express? No. What is the structure of the concept? How does it work in their mind? I don't really know. But I just think that's from their behavior, it's not unreasonable to say that they are thinking about the acorn, that they have a state which represents the acorn, that they even may be aware of that state in various ways. So how far down this goes, I don't know. Could bees have inner awareness? I don't see why not. They have sophisticated brains. That's not exactly the same states, but they could have states of inner awareness. We'd have to say what they are and how they get realized in the brain. So I don't think we are really in a position to say that. So I know I'm rambling, but just to ramble a bit more, we're not even sure like what the inner awareness we're looking for should be thought of. So some people might say, look, it's a kind of self-consciousness. So, they're thinking about Sartre and Husserl, and Sartre was always talking about, pre-reflective self-consciousness and the pre-reflective cogito, and, the I think before it becomes aware of itself, but it's still sort of aware of itself, but not. So then you get into all these, interesting debates where the lineage starts from thinking of inner awareness as a kind of self-consciousness, maybe pre-reflective self-consciousness, but still self-consciousness. And then you go, okay, where in the brain will we find that? Oh, the parietal cortex over here, the insula, whatever. So then you would think of looking in those areas. And some higher theorists that are really influenced by that line, I'm thinking of Rocco Gennaro and people in that tradition, that's what they think. Whereas if you think of higher order awareness as a kind of more of a cognitive state, then it's going to be kind of like metacognition, cognition about cognition. It's not exactly the same as metacognition as psychologists use it, because that's usually effortful and something you have to do on purpose and conscious, whereas this kind of thing would be implicit and done effortlessly and not something you're aware of, unconscious. So different in that sense, but still a kind of like akin to it, in which case, if you were trying to find it, you would look for areas of the brain that did metacognition, which would be more frontal areas. So just even saying, what is inner awareness? Is it metacognition like, or is it self-consciousness like? Is it perception like? Well, then you might think it's in a different area. So before you even go to the bee brain and start looking around in there, you would have to nail all this stuff down and say, how does all this stuff map onto what's going on in the bee brain? And it's not clear. I mean, right now we have some guesses like, oh, the prefrontal cortex is involved in metacognition in some way. The parietal cortex involved in bodily awareness or something like that in some way. Okay, great. So if you interpret the higher order states as being crucially linked to one or the other of those, then that gives you something to look for. But it's not clear that we should think of it as in one way or the other. That requires an argument. That requires an interpretation. So unfortunately, the whole animal thing is pretty vexed, I would say, as far as like knowing what would count. And in the background, you kind of even further zooming out is a kind of like an assumption about the way reality works. So some people think that the way reality works is that stuff happens and then at some point brains showed up. Cool. And those brains might have been unconscious, completely and totally without experience, but still representing the environment and having cognitive states and controlling behavior and, getting around the environment pretty good without anything we would call experience. And in fact, they might even say, what you need to do is explain how it is you start from a brain with no experience and then add stuff to it so that you get experience. Okay. Whereas the other side might say, no. You start, some stuff happens, brains arise. And as soon as there's brains, they're conscious because there's something about maybe life itself or brains in particular, where as soon as they show up, boom, consciousness. So you don't have to explain this other thing that gets added on. You just need to account for the systems that make the creature aware of the environment or something. So so these two fundamental attitudes that one, you start with the assumption that everything is non-conscious, and then you have to give an argument for thinking that it's conscious and how that could happen. Whereas the other side says, no, you start with the assumption that everything's conscious, brain-wise. I mean, not everything and psychic. You start with the assumption that it's conscious, and then have to give an argument for thinking that it's not. So because they just have this different attitude about how to approach something like the brain. Now, once you start being serious about this, then you have to say, well, what do you mean by conscious? Do you mean access conscious, phenomenal conscious, introspective consciousness, the person being conscious? So there's, a trillion concepts, and it's not clear that everyone's talking about the same one. But if you can get them to talk about phenomenal consciousness and what it's like to have the experience, then the question boils down to, when the brain shows up, the first brain system, is there anything that it's like from its point of view? By the way, it's even an assumption that the answer is definitively yes or no, because someone like Dan Dennett's going to say the answer is might be kinda or sorta, to which I don't really understand, but some people are going to say, look, that question's too vague because there's going to be in-between systems that are partially conscious so I just think the whole thing is kind of not well understood. People have really strong intuitions because they describe really simple cases. Mary's in her room. She knows everything. I've never seen red. And you have this clear picture. She learns. Good. But once you go through the details, it's so complicated that if at the end of it, you're sort of not left befuddled, I just don't think you actually were doing it seriously. So that's how I ended up in the, people are saying, stop being so cautious and just pick a side, or what do you really believe? Like, what I really believe is that it's hard and that everywhere you go, there's a million options that there's some reason to take serious. So that I think that the most reasonable thing to do is simply say, it's a mess. But even so, if I laid them all out on the table and had to distribute my cards in various ways, then I would do so, in the way we've been discussing. And that some of what would guide that would be this more general ethical consideration of give the benefit of the doubt in cases of not knowing.
Right. Be consistent with your day-to-day moral attitudes. We don't treat children ethically because we recognize that they might feel pain or that you might find a way to empathize with them. It's just
exactly. I mean, we treat them that way because it seems like they're in pain.
Yeah, and if you spend any time around animals, then you must also experience the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think infant consciousness is the same thing. There are some theorists who are going to claim that an infant isn't conscious, phenomenally conscious. And I actually saw someone on Twitter. I mean, I kind of had to stop using Twitter because it can suck you down a rabbit hole. But I did, when I was on Twitter, I saw people, someone in particular, I won't mention anyway, they reacted very strongly to the idea that maybe infants are not conscious. And some theorists actually think it's an open question or we don't really know. And this person was like, what's wrong with these guys? It's obvious that infants are conscious. And in some sense, I sort of think that's the right response from the point of view of a person. but it's not the right response from the point of view of a scientist. Because I think that, personally, yeah, it's obvious that babies are, uh, are conscious, but from a scientific point of view, I don't think it's obvious that they are or aren't. I think what's really hard is knowing what counts as the evidence. So that is this methodological question about, is the baby crying good enough reason to think it's experiencing pain? Um, well, it's a good enough reason to convince me that it is, and I should treat it that way outside the lab. But if I'm just thinking from an objective standpoint, then you could have cases where that behavior is produced in a non-conscious way. So then you want to understand, well, is this one produced in a conscious way, and what makes it so? So it's again that kind of depending on how you approach things. So do you look at the infant and say, well, it's got a brain, it's moving around, so it's got to be experiencing something? Or do you start with the assumption that everything could be explained non-consciously and then have to argue for the existence of um, the mental state? The reason why I think that this theoretical issue should be separated from the moral ones, because you get cases where this practically has been applied in weird ways, like, infants being circumcised without anesthesia, because, well, infants don't feel pain, right? So he's crying, but it's maybe not experiencing pain. So I think that even if you believe the theory, the way it's acting should convince you not to do it. So I don't think that you should, or another case, if you think like persons with hydroencephaly, who have, brain water in their cranium instead of the brain, and usually often only have a brain stem or a limited part of the rest of the brain that develops, they can still smile and have certain kinds of behaviors. And some people are going to argue, well, that suggests they're conscious. Other people are going to suggest, no, that's an automatic response. But if you are convinced that they're not conscious, but then you treat that person in a different way, like by not flipping them over in their bed so they develop bed sores, or, arguing that they neglecting their cleaning routine, or because, it doesn't matter anyway if they're dirty, whether they don't feel anything. I think that once you start thinking that way about a person, whether conscious or not, bad things happen. So that's where I would say, look, morally, where we should treat them in certain ways, whether or not we think of them as experiencing anything. And I guess that's some people think that's controversial. I don't, but what do I know?
So shifting gears a little bit, there's been some recent work done on emotions and higher order theories. Do you mind explaining what's going on there?
Sure. So what emotions are is obviously interesting topic, and there's a whole philosophy of emotions and a neuroscience of emotions, and there's a philosophy of consciousness and a neuroscience of consciousness, and you might think that they obviously go together, but they often don't obviously go together in terms of the work that people are doing. So that you find people working on these sort of in different areas, not talking to each other. But so, for example, in the science of emotions, there's a debate which looks very much like a version of the higher order, first order debate between what are called constructivists about emotions, and persons that think that there's kind of a basic set of emotions that we share with animals. So one kind of camp says that emotions are learned, and that we're not sort of born innately with emotional disposition or capacities. But rather we're born with a general system which allows us to construct emotional responses. So that sounds a bit like a higher order theory, where you have certain physiological responses that can be interpreted in one way versus another way. So, you have classic empirical results where you give people a stimulant and they don't know it, so their heart rate increases and their breathing increases. And then you put one in a room with someone acting nervous and another one in a room with someone acting belligerent, and one person will report feeling nervous and the other one will report feeling angered or excited. And it sort of seems that what's happening is they both have the same physiological stimulant, so their heart is racing and their breathing is increased, but they're interpreting like, oh, I must be agitated because something is nervous in this room, or I must be agitated because there's some reason to be angry. So you're telling yourself kind of a story about why your body is reacting this way, and that's sort of the emotion. Um, so that in the science, neuroscience of emotions, this is, there's a lot of people debating this. Um, in philosophy, we have the higher order theory of consciousness, what we've already been discussing, which sounds somewhat similar. It says you have these first order states, and then you have your interpretation of them. So when I was talking, I actually met Joe Ledoux because of a music event that I used to organize called the Qualia Fest, which was a lame attempt to get a bunch of neuroscientists and philosophers together to play music, because it turns out that a lot of them do. And Joe has a band called the Amygdaloids, which they're still playing. The Amygdaloids are, they play what they call heavy mental music, and they write songs about fear and anxiety and so forth. And Ledoux is the guitar player and singer. So I play the drums and had a couple of groups or whatever. So I got these groups together to play at this event in New York. Not because anyone's any good, in my opinion, but just because it's hilarious to see neuroscientists and philosophers jamming together. So it was a free event. We never really charged money or anything like that to come out. But anyway, it's a lot of work to organize that stuff, it turns out. And then it got out of hand. The New York Times wrote an article about it, and I was like, oh man, this is not the kind of attention we want. Anyway, I got off topic. The point is, that's how I met Joe, was by finding out about his band and emailing him and saying, I'm a philosopher and I'm organizing this music event, and would your band come to this shitty dive bar and play with a bunch of philosophers? And he was like, yes, I will. And he showed up at the shitty dive bar full on ready to play, and did for we had 4 of those qualities. Anyway, so that's how I got to know him, not through philosophy or science, as it turns out, but hanging out in the bar talking about music and stuff. And, I didn't really know who he was in the sense of, he's a famous neuroscientist. So I'd heard his name. I knew he was well known. I didn't know like at what level he really was at that time. Anyway, so we started talking, and it turns out that we realized that there was this, like, there's 2 conversations going on at the same time that we're using similar lines of evidence, talking about, blind sight and missing certain part of the brain, but still having the experience, like the same sorts of evidence, but not really connecting them together. So the first idea that we had was, we want to get these 2 sides of the debate talking to each other: the neuroscientists who do emotion and the conscious researchers, the people that are talking about higher order and first order theories, because they have something to say. And to sort of start the conversation, we wanted to offer a theory of the emotions in higher order terms. And that really, was Joe's idea. Siri thinks I'm talking to her. Never mind. Sorry. Get out of here, Siri. How do you turn Siri? There you go. Okay, sorry. Anyway, so he had some ideas that he wanted to develop, but he was, wanting to phrase them or put them in a way that other higher order theorists would recognize, so to speak. And to make a long story short, the basic idea that he had was that the states of which we're aware might themselves be in the prefrontal cortex, because there was at that time a common assumption that higher order theories were kind of committed to this simple division between the front of the brain being the higher order state and the back of the brain being the first order state. And this was aware of that. And Joe's idea was like, it might all be up here. There might be first order states in some areas of the prefrontal cortex, and there might be an awareness of those states in another area of the prefrontal cortex, so that the whole system, in a way, is at that level, anatomically, a higher order level. And that, I think that his view is sort of that there's 2 systems that are joined together by causal links, but that, like, the amygdala first order system, that the lower order system can kind of be detached in a way from the higher order system. And his idea was that, so according to him and the view we developed, you don't get born experiencing fear. You get born detecting threats. So the amygdala is a threat detector and is in charge of what he calls a survival circuit, which is organizing a certain suite of behaviors which are engaged when you encounter a threat. And that can happen completely non-consciously without any experience of fear or anything like that. Um, uh, and over time, what you learn is that certain things are threatening to you and certain things are dangerous and certain situations are, you know, ones that get you to think about being in danger. That's anxiety. So according to him, fear involves a threat currently in front of you, and anxiety involves thinking about a future threat or one that's in the past. Um, so, okay, so you're learning which things are threatening and which things are dangerous. And you come then to, over time, not only represent that there's a snake there, but that the snake is dangerous to you, that you have been threatened by the snake in the past. And once you get to that point, you experience fear, according to Ledoux. So the fear experience involves this explicit higher order awareness of you being in the presence of danger. So it's not just the detection of a threat. It's not even the guidance of behavior directed at avoiding the threat. It's this explicit recognition that it's you who's in danger rather than just that there's danger out there. It's me. I'm in danger. That's fear, as he would put it in slogan form: no self, no fear. So he thinks that you've got to represent that as you in the danger, importantly. And those higher representations, he thinks, could be found in the prefrontal cortex, like maybe in the frontal pole, maybe in a network involving, there's different hypotheses you could have. But the idea that kind of connects this to the higher theory is that rather than thinking there's two systems, one for my experience of red and one for my experience of fear, there's one system, which just deals with experience generally. Experience of red, experience of fear are just different ways that the higher order state can represent what's going on at the lower level. And so one of the analogies that he often uses is that, like, the emotions are like a soup, right? There's no such thing as a chicken soup ingredient. There are things which you can use to make chicken soup, but it would be wrong to think of as celery as intrinsically wanting to be chicken soup or to be something else. So same with fear. There's no thing which counts as fear, but rather it's what unites all elements of fear is that there's something that you think is presenting a threat to you currently. And so we think you could have that without the amygdala. And there's a case of a woman with bilateral lesions to the amygdala. She was hailed as the woman without fear. And then there was a case where she could experience fear, though. And there's this interview with her where she even says that when they asphyxiated her, so they put her in a condition where she couldn't breathe, and then she started having this fear response to asphyxiation. And even though her amygdala was gone, what she says afterwards is that she didn't think there's anything wrong with her fear experience, and it felt like fear. And so that's what we think is part of the evidence that you could have fear experience without the amygdala, because the amygdala will offer some content to the higher order state that colors or flavors the fear in a certain way by tweaking the content of the higher order state, if this theory is right. But it itself is not the feeling of fear. The amygdala's activity is a non-conscious threat detector, which then activates this higher order representation of me being in a threat situation. And that could be activated in different ways, as it was in this woman. It wasn't activated by the amygdala. She didn't have one. It was activated by something else. It could be activated by, your fear of being dead. So you might think about, gee, I'm going to die someday, and suddenly you have this like panic attack or something. And that would be, higher state being activated, not by the amygdala detecting a threat, but by your abstract conceptualization of the end of your existence triggering this higher representation. So that would be the idea, is that it allows you to explain all of these different kind of experiences with one single system. and that the difference between like seeing red and feeling fear is exactly the difference between representing yourself as seeing red versus representing yourself as being afraid of.
Wow. All that from that gig.
Yeah, all that from a yeah, exactly. Yes, all that from that gig. Yeah.
So continuing with that, from a higher order perspective, what do you think of the idea of well-being, the psychological idea of well-being?
Yeah. So I think that it's important to take into consideration the person when you're thinking about psychology or psychiatry. So I think that, like, for example, a lot of CBT, like cognitive behavioral therapy, um, is aimed at the behavior of the person and maybe the way the person thinks sub personally or something like that. But they're not really worried aimed at the experience of the person or what it's like to be the person. In fact, those things are not what you're taking into consideration. You're taking into consideration like how can I do something else, get them to reconceptualize what's going on, or expose them to something, or whatever the case may be. But you're not really worried about their, maybe in some abstract sense you're worried about their well-being because you're trying to make them better. But really, what you're doing is adjusting their behavior. And the same is true with psychopharmacology. So if you take Paxil or Prozac, then by the way, there's a whole big drama about that recently, which, serotonin is being currently reevaluated. And it's not really clear that we have as much evidence as we thought we did that this correlation exists between states of mood and states of serotonin. Anyway, but yeah, there's been a big longitudinal study that recently came out, which suggests it's not as clear as maybe we thought it was. Anyway, so what was I saying? Oh yeah, right. So suppose that you're very depressed. Your mood is, depressed. You don't want to go to work. You're not interested in the same things that you used to be. You don't care about philosophy anymore. You're not reading your books or going to the after work functions or whatever the case may be. So you're depressed. Like, and suppose that this lasts for a period of time so that it becomes clinically significant, not just a passing thing over the weekend, but now it's months and months. Great. So then you go and maybe get some help and they diagnose you with depression. And then they say, well, okay, here's some medication, start taking it. And then you got to go to therapy as well. Great. So the medication we know is correlated with a change in behavior. So if you take the medication, then chances are you'll go back to work and go back to school and complete the after school assignments or whatever. But no one ever says like, I'm cured. I feel like myself again. I feel so much better. Like, gee, what a relief. So that has not occurred. We don't have a cure for depression. What we have is something that alters behavior of depressed persons. And that's good, to some degree or other. They don't lose their jobs. They can carry on socially, but they don't feel good. And you can ask anyone who's I've never taken Prozac or Paxil, but I've talked to tons of people who have. And I've never heard anyone say, it changed my life for the better. I felt great. I felt like my old self again. They say, no, I felt weird, like not like myself actually. But I was still, able to go to work. And that's because that's what the drug does. And that's because when we study what the drug does, we test it on rats. So what you do is you shock a rat a bunch of times so that it becomes averse to the environment. And then you give it this drug and lo and behold, it goes back into that room where the shock happens. So you change the rat's behavior. But did you make the rat feel better? I don't know. What does that mean? How can we test that? We have no clue. And in fact, no one ever talks about that in the animal literature on this stuff. No one says the rat feels better. What they say is its behavior change. It doesn't, it may not be afraid or feel anxiety, but those are code words for its behavior is such and such and blah and blah. So in that sense, I think well-being is sorely missing from a lot of what we think of as therapeutic medicine, because the subject, the person themselves, their state of mind, their experience, their conscious experience is not really part of the equation. Yeah, you've got to go to therapy, and they talk about how do you feel maybe in therapy, and it makes you feel better. Talking to someone is good, Talking to a therapist is even better. It does have some effect. It has about the same effect as taking the Paxil, actually. So why does we have this mismatch? Talking to people, focusing on well-being in that way, the psychological well-being of the person is effective, but not all by itself very effective. Giving the person a certain kind of drug is effective, but not by itself all very effective. So it kind of looks like the evidence suggests that you got to have an interplay between the two, because maybe there's two systems here, actually. Maybe giving the drugs is affecting the first order system, which is changing the behavior, but not changing the experience. So that's why the experience remains kind of the same, like, not great, but the behavior's changed. So the cause and effect drags one to the other. So you stop taking the drugs and you don't get the great effect anymore. Whereas on the other hand, the talk therapy may be adjusting the way you're conceptualizing the situation, the way you think about things. So your higher order states, in other words, the way you're conceptualizing it. And that may change your experience, but not the behavior, because that's being produced by the first order state. So it's at least, this is part of the argument that Joe and I were trying to develop in this. And this really is more, he was the driving force behind this argument, but I agree with him and try to help him say it. Is that this might be because we're thinking there's one system here that does consciousness and behavior. But maybe there's not. Maybe there's two systems, one for behavior, one for consciousness. Maybe, and that's sort of what the higher order theory predicts, is that there's going to be two systems, one that's partly involved in the first order states which drive the behavior, and one that's partly involved in the inner awareness that is the conscious experience. And you got to focus on both of them. So, and this is the dirty secret of the pharmacology sciences, that there's no new drugs for 50 years. We're still giving people Thorazine. Thorazine was discovered in the 50s. So, great. We can say what Thorazine does on serotonin and blah, blah, blah. We can say what Paxil does to serotonin and blah, blah, blah. But we haven't, on the basis of all of our new technology and knowledge of the brain, invented some new drug which worked better than these ones that we discovered kind of by chance. So, that's somewhat depressing, and has actually caused a lot of companies to pull funding out of research in this area, because they're just not finding. When you compare what's happened with antibiotics, like in my lifetime, when I was little, they just gave you like amoxicillin, penicillin. Now we're like on third generation drugs that like have names that I don't even recognize, and they're not cillins anymore. They're not based on mold. We discover something else about how to kill these things. So yeah, we can go back to that stuff if we need to, but we have this whole other class of drugs that work in a different way based on our further understanding of what's going on. And we haven't achieved that in the psychopharmacology. And maybe our suggestion is that's because we're focusing not on the experience of the person, because that's kind of a dirty word, and we want to be cognitive behavioral. Okay, but where's the experience? Where's the well-being of the person? What it's like to be them? So actually, I think that it's important that does show up in there as part of our full understanding. I think some phenomenology is important. You got to have both ends of it. You got to know what it's like, and you got to know how the brain works, and got to connect them. And anytime you try to ignore one or the other, you're going to end up with a problem. So, as far as the science of well-being and like what contributes to it, I didn't really talk about that, but I do think that understanding the experience of the person, like explicitly putting that up front and saying the goal of therapy should be changing what it's like for you, changing your experience of the world. That it should make you feel better. And that doesn't seem to be the explicit goal of a lot of this research. So that in some people find that quite shocking to say the experience of the person. That's very vague and subjective. Yeah, but got to deal with what you're dealing with. So anyway, so that would be I do think it's important for those reasons.
Well, it's important that you take phenomenal subjective consciousness seriously and you put it front and center, where today there's some growing skepticism about that.
Yeah, exactly. And part of, hopefully what we're seeing is phenomenal consciousness being taken a little bit more seriously, at least in scientific circles. I mean, by the way, not to circle back too much to IT, but this is why some people think that, we don't want to have a bunch of wild theories running around, because we're trying to sort of be respectable and establish a science of consciousness, like a cognitive neuroscience of consciousness. And if you imagine like what people did with attention used to be like a word that was vague and no one knew what it meant. And then now we have a whole branch of neuroscience that deals with attention and theories of attention. And they didn't get there by saying attention is a fundamental feature of the universe and everything has a little bit of attention. Now they got there by positing a kind of model and then testing it, a simple model. So now, however you feel about attention is it's a whole area of neuroscience that you get a PhD in and then try to find a job working just on attention. And the hope is that cognitive neuroscience of consciousness could end up like that, where you get a PhD in the neuroscience of consciousness and just do that, as opposed to having to say, oh, I study perception, and then say, yeah, and I like consciousness. Or, I do attention and I like consciousness, which is sort of how it is now. So I don't know. I'm a philosopher, so we get to talk about weird stuff and it doesn't really affect us. But I can kind of see that in the sociology of science, a lot more depends on funding agencies, and this sort of, perception from the outside plays a different role. And whereas no one really outright says I'm a behaviorist, the hangover of behaviorism is it's evident. And a lot of people don't like this talk of subjective states that you can't nail down behaviorally wise. So yeah, I do think that respectability should be on our minds. And, there is this kind of line of argument that goes as follows. Consciousness science was established by the credibility of some big shots. So Francis Crick and Christoph Koch kind of get credit for initiating the current scientific study of consciousness in some sense by broaching that topic. And of course, he only did that after he won the Nobel Prize in a different area, whether legitimately or not, who knows, but he did. And he had a bunch of like street cred from that. And then he said, oh, let me talk about consciousness. And people took him seriously in a sense because he was a Nobel Prize winning guy. So no one would have really taken, no scientist probably would have taken the theories that they were saying about consciousness seriously without that street cred. And there's another famous case, Rutger Penrose, another one. Famous guy comes in and says something about consciousness, and people take it seriously because he's a famous guy. So the line of argument goes, we kind of got to discharge a debt. So we borrowed some credibility from those famous guys. So we got to repay them by being serious and not simply running amok and doing some wild or wacky stuff. So, I'm not a neuroscientist in that sense. So I don't really feel the force of the argument as much as someone who was in that field. But I do feel it somewhat. And I do sort of think, yeah, we want to behave reputably to some degree or other because the more serious guys are watching, and we would like some money from them. Templeton funding us is nice, but if they're the only ones doing it, then, that's a problem because we want the National Endowment for the Sciences and big first-rate funding agencies to think of consciousness as a legitimate topic of scientific inquiry.
This is fair. But nowadays there's so much exciting stuff happening that's friendly to these circles, right? Like ecological psychology, 4E cognition, that stuff.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I saw you had Tony Stromero on. I was going to watch that one too. Yeah, that's a whole other approach, that tries to make do without representations I wouldn't say at all, but tries to minimize the need for representations, which I think is very interesting. I'm not against that sort of view. I think that there are non-representational versions of higher theories that basically all of this stuff is work that should be done because, again, we don't know. But, someone should be working on higher theories as well. And so I guess that, I used to say someone should write a book on this stuff, and I just hope it's not me, but now it's this looking like probably no one else is going to do it. I do think that the higher theory has been shrouded in a veil of philosophy for a long time, and it's been difficult for scientists to try to parse it out. So I don't know if I'm making that worse or better, but I hope to try to make it better.
I think I have a weird experience where with philosophy, where as long as I've known philosophy, it's always been, well, you do the philosophy and then you go understand the relevant
Uh-huh.
science. And I mean, of course, there's no institutional support for that. You kind of
Right.
just have to go and do it. Um, so it's always striking to encounter how siloed off these things are. I mean, it does, it does happen. You just experience it all the time.
It happens more than that. I mean, I remember when I was first like into the graduate school of looking at neuroscience, and I almost switched. I almost went from philosophy to neuroscience, but I was too squeamish to deal with the rats. So once I started having to do like the surgery and chopping their heads off and opening the brain up and stuff, I was like, yeah. Um, Not that I was against that being done, because I do think that it's tragic that animals are used in research, but I also think that the knowledge gained can be justified by utilitarian means, for example, um, by the benefit to animals and humans. Although I think it's a difficult argument to make, and the use of animals in science is a difficult topic. It's pretty brutal. But anyway, uh, so I was almost gonna like give up on philosophy and sort of try to focus on doing science. And I had worked in a couple labs or whatever. Um, the animal labs were just too much for me. So that's when I switched to doing psychology. But I forgot even why I started saying this. Now I got distracted by thinking about the rats. Sorry, I lost my point.
The separation, the silos of,
Oh, the silos, right? Exactly. So I remember when I first started going down that route, I was taking more graduate level classes in neuroscience, going to conferences and hanging out with the lab more, people in the lab and visiting the lab and stuff. Um, they were saying they're going to go to this interdisciplinary conference, that they're the scientists. And I remember thinking, oh, cool. Wow. Gee, what's it going to be, like philosophy and neuroscience? And they were like, no, it's going to be the electrophysiology people and the genetics people. So they were both there was a neuroscience conference, but the electrophys people were going to talk to the molecular genetics people. And this was big news, like, because these people never talk to each other. So the siloing effect is even worse. I mean, I never would have thought of that as interdisciplinary. I was like, that's all neuroscience, right? And they're like, oh, no, 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 no. Like, they do something completely different than we do. And so anyway, it was like mind opening for me to realize that by interdisciplinary, that was interdisciplinary. So when we think of neuroscience and philosophy, that's already too like large of a scale. You got to think about like analytic philosophy and cognitive neuroscience, or something like that. But these things, the siloing is everywhere, and that's kind of sadly, we've known this ever since C.P. Snow and the two cultures. People have sort of known that we've been the academic culture itself kind of fosters this siloing, which is why I've made it essential thing in my work to try to bust out of that silo and to try to get over and talk to the people in the other areas and work with them even and write papers together. And what we find is we don't often speak the same language. We're using the word representation. Ledoux means something different than I mean by it. We have to find out, okay, so how do we say things that because we're using the same word, but actually meaning different things by it. It's actually very difficult to try to work interdisciplinary. So that's why people silo, I think, partially because the academic structure kind of makes it easy, but also because it's easy to talk to people who know what you're talking about. And if you use a shared vocabulary, who cite the same people, and you go, oh, you can cite Hebb 1944 and go, oh, yes, Hebb. Whereas if you're in a different discipline, you may not know who the fuck's Donald Hebb. Like, I have no idea. So those lineages of like what we have in common, and if I make a casual reference, will you get it or not? I think that really has a large contributing factor.
yeah, I think I misspoke where the siloing is the default. You have to silo, but some people do it, and some people lean into it completely and are happy to, where others kind of do it begrudgingly, but still think outside of those lines.
Exactly. I mean, I think of myself as a philosopher, but I also think that at a certain point, like some of the papers I've written are in theoretical neuroscience. And they're written by a philosopher. I teach neuroscience classes, and I think some of the papers that Joe Ledoux has written are philosophy papers. And he's a neuroscientist, so I think that at a certain point, we kind of recognize that these questions, well, it doesn't, they can be answered for the difference between how I would answer the question, how someone like Joe Ledoux would answer the question is because of our training. And so how we conceptualize the question and what we might think of as the possible answers, given like where we have come from, but we're sort of thinking about the same stuff and trying to answer similar questions, which is why we want to break out of these styles. Anyway, I must be getting tired because I'm losing my train of thought a lot lately. So, I was trying to say that I think it's important I agree with you what you're saying, that to break out of these silos, and to get these dialogues, even if you don't agree. I think that you're always, I mean, it really becomes easy to wrap yourself deep into a theory. And in fact, that's sort of where your time goes. Like you want to get into a certain corner of theoretical space. And then you want to see it from that point of view and then see where you can make a contribution or add something or like say, no, this connects over there. But what's really challenging is to be able to do that and then go to a completely, like for instance, thinking about higher theories and then to sort of uproot your entire mental system and then say, what if I'm a panpsychist now? Or what if I'm a global workspace theorist? That's very difficult to do. And I think people, you spend so much time trying to understand a particular point of view that trying to understand another one is almost, it's alien. It's difficult to break out of the conceptual structure that you had to build in order to understand in the detail that you do this particular way of approaching it. Which is why when you really look at what a lot of work is, when they object to another theory, they're just expressing their own theory in another way, so to speak. The objection doesn't really target the other theory because they haven't really put themselves in that position and fully thought out, like, from this point of view, what does the theory say? Which is why I always tell students it's really easy to tear down another person's theory. What's really difficult is to say, why would a non-idiot come to this view? Why would someone who's not stupid but is intelligent have this theoretical outlook, which from my point of view is so strange or whatever? That's much more difficult because it requires sort of taking serious the other way of looking at things. And people just find out very difficult to do because it requires, first of all, saying, well, gee, I might be wrong. So let me put a pin in what I believe. And the closer you get toward their core beliefs, like you see this really with ethics and religious beliefs, like the closer you get towards, and consciousness is in there, by the way, because it's centered on ethics, religion, consciousness. I think that they all come, that they are tightly joined as a kind of core to a lot of central questions to like our personal identities in a way. So that messing with one or the other can feel very uncomfortable, which is why, I really, to sum all this up in put it together, hopefully, I really endorse the kind of Socratic idea about what philosophy is, that to really should question one's own belief until you get to the point where you recognize that you don't know. That's what philosophy really is a self-evaluation, a self-undermining, in a way. Everything that you think you're going to lean on as your fundamental crutch, that's where you got to focus on and say, why do I believe that? What's the evidence for it? And should I believe it? And why would a person who's as intelligent or more than me not believe that, even if you think it's the bedrock of your whole existence? And some people find that very unsettling, that you could question some fundamental, like core, that there is a self, that there is a physical reality, that there is a God, that whatever, that consciousness is real. It can be very unsettling. So I think that part of this, this exercise is enlightening, in that deep sense of enlightening, that it teaches you not only about yourself, but about just something deep about our place in reality, seeing things from other people's point of view. And it sounds kind of like something casual you just say, seeing it from that point of view, but actually doing it is very difficult. Entering into another person's worldview seriously is very challenging. And Aristotle said the mark of an educated mind is to entertain the view without accepting it. So I think we can kind of casually recite that, but I actually think that's a deep insight. Yeah, it's actually very hard to entertain something without accepting it. To say, if this were true, how would the world be, without fully endorsing the truth of it. So anyway, so I do think that whatever philosophy turns out academically in life, that core idea of self-evaluation, and that Socrates had, that is know thyself. Um, and that it ultimately leads you to a place where real knowledge begins, which is admitting that you don't know. Um, that's that'll never go away.
Yeah, yeah. To me, being an Understood player in any sense is always really difficult because I mean, you have to just because of the amount of work, right? That you need a ton of training from a ton of different areas, and there's always the fear of giving into a certain perspective or the crowd or this or that. Um, yeah, and to your credit, like I think you've done a lot for making philosophy accessible and putting it on the internet. And I know your channel has been one that I've gotten certainly back to a bunch of times, and I'm sure that's the experience for a lot of people. So, yeah,
Yeah, I'm surprised by that, but cool. I never know if anyway, yes, no, I appreciate you saying that.
yeah. I mean, that seems like a best place as any to end it off. Did you have anything you would like to sign off on?
Yeah, I just want to say thanks for inviting me, and this has been a great discussion. And I think that channels like yours that try to have serious discussions with people, that we need more of them. And a lot of philosophy channels, they're out there. It's somewhat surprising that there are a lot of philosophy channels out there, but some of them lean into this really argumentative style of debate, where it's like people yelling at each other. And even I've been sucked into that because it's hard not to. But it's philosophy is best done coolly and passionately is fine, but without belittling or making other people feel stupid or trying to play a gotcha game. So conversations that are like this, that are in depth, open ended, and try to just try to get what a person thinks without trying to undermine their position or make them feel attacked or something like that, I think is important. And I think that, so I'm more than happy to be involved with this kind of stuff. But generally, I hope more people subscribe to your channel. You only have 1,000 subscribers or so at this point. So we need more people to come over here and check out these cool conversations.
Wow, thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time.